I'd like to make sure we all understand about this business of the compulsion obsession to drink being removed. For some people it happens real fast, and others it may take a while. But we have an absolute promise that it will happen. If you want to know what the authority for that is, all you have to do is remember what you hear at every single meeting you go to. We call them the three pertinent ideas. That we're alcoholic, can't manage our own lives, no human power, as far as, whatever it says. But in paraphrasing now, God can and will if we seek Him. Now you have to think what that means. That means that if we are seeking God, the compulsion of obsession to drink is removed. It just goes, it's gone. Now the next question you ask yourself is, how do I seek God? What's the method in the Big Book? That's simple too. We work the steps. It is the working of the steps that the Big Book gives us as the pathway to seeking God. Now, this means then that when we get going on working the steps, we're also headed in the direction of having the obsession, compulsion to drink lifted from us. And that's not just an idle observation in the three pertinent ideas. It's an absolute promise, and it's true. All right, let's go back to page Romans 13, please. Forward to the first edition. The next sentence, right in the middle of the first paragraph. We think this account of our experiences will help everyone to better understand the alcoholic. Many do not comprehend that the alcoholic is a very sick person. Now, those two sentences indicate to us that the people who wrote this book had a very large interest, a big interest, in educating the general public. It was they had a major concern that one of the biggest roadblocks to the recovery of the alcoholic was the attitude of the public, the ignorance the public had in terms of what was really going on with the alcoholic, and especially those people who would be close to the recovering alcoholic, the family and friends and employers and so on. So they had a major part of their emphasis in this program was to educate the general public as to what alcoholism really is. And then the last sentence, besides we're sure that our way of living has its advantages for all. Well, there isn't any doubt that that's true. I have written a treatise which I call 12 Steps Are for Everybody. And the theme is that the 12 steps are not the private property of Alcoholics Anonymous or other 12-step groups, but in fact are a way of living equally important and applicable to every human being, which it is absolutely certain that they are. And the reason that the 12 steps are for everybody is because these 12 steps are spiritual principles. And they're uniquely applicable to the alcoholic simply because we have lost any touch of spirituality. We're spiritually bankrupt when we come in. It's very important for us to regain, or to maybe for the first time in our lives have a spiritual awakening. But these spiritual principles apply to every human being. And therefore, when people work the steps and incorporate these spiritual principles into their lives, it doesn't matter whether they're an alcoholic, an addict, a nail biter, an overeater, or oversexed, or anything. Even a lint picker or a nose picker, doesn't matter. Because it applies to every single human being. And these spiritual principles work for every single human being. Everybody's life gets better when they live on spiritual principles. When they live a life of surrender and obedience. And that's what this is ultimately all about. There is, by the way, a part of the big book. There's authority for this proposition. Let's take a quick look on page 116. As you can see, this is the chapter to wives, and this is a wife speaking, purportedly. The second full paragraph starts right in the middle of page 116 in the fourth edition, and near the bottom in the third edition. We have elsewhere remarked how much better life is when lived on the spiritual plane. If God can solve the age-old riddle of alcoholism, He can solve your problems too. We wives found that, like everybody else, we were afflicted with pride, self-pity, vanity, and all the things that go to make up the self-centered person. And we were not above selfishness or dishonesty. As our husbands began to apply spiritual principles in their lives, we began to see the desirability of doing so too. So the wives found, just as it tells us here in this forward of the first edition, that these steps, this program, have advantages for all. Now notice that it talks about a way of living. The big book also gives us the backup for that. And when we're studying the ninth step, we find the big book says that spiritual life is not a theory that we have to live. So when it talks about our way of living, it's talking about a way of living described in the 12 steps, which is that we try to carry this message and practice these principles in all of our affairs. So you can begin to see that this forward of the first edition covered a lot of subjects in a hurry, and all of them are apropos. They're all part of what we're going to be studying later as we read the book. Going on the second paragraph on page 13, it is important that we remain anonymous because we are too few at present to handle the overwhelming number of personal appeals which may result from this publication. Being mostly business and professional folk, we could not well carry on our occupations in such an event. We would like to understood that our alcoholic work is an avocation. Now, that's only part of the story, guys. Later, when Bill wrote the 12 traditions in 1945, he had found that anonymity is this is describing here in this paragraph, has a much broader and more important, more profound meaning for us. He found that anonymity is in fact an expression of our willingness to sacrifice our needs and our wants to be famous, to have, to be well known, to have a claim to be considered heroes or heroines. That we put aside all that natural propensity to be well known and to be well loved and to be thought of kindly. Put it aside. We sacrifice that in the interest of the unity of the fellowship. Now, I want you to notice that even though the first reason given here is because they were afraid they were going to be swamped with requests for help and so on, And the second, more powerful reason being that we need to stay humble, we need to be willing to sacrifice our own needs in order to ensure the unity of the fellowship. But neither one of these reasons for anonymity has anything at all to do with fear. Now, if you listen to some of the common wisdom around the rooms these days, you would get the impression, certainly in many cases, a flat-out statement, that the reason we're anonymous is we're afraid somebody might rat us out. Somebody might tell on us. Somebody might let other people know that we're alcoholics, that we're in recovery. Well, these guys did not pander to fear, and we ought not to do that either. The 12th tradition had nothing to do with the fear of discovery. As a matter of fact, if you look at the 11th tradition, it tells us when we are to refrain from using our last name. And that's at the public level. Press, radio, films, and TV. It's got nothing to do with around the rooms or among our friends or family. Alcoholics Anonymous is the name of the book, and Alcoholics Anonymous is worldwide name of worldwide recognition, but it does not mean alcoholics afraid, alcoholics fearful. And the purpose for anonymity has nothing to do with the fear of discovery. Among other things, we have developed this custom in most groups now of nobody ever saying our last name. And you know, it's a shame because I know hundreds of people in AA, and I only know the last names of a handful. How many times I've been embarrassed having to call the hospital and ask if Mary A. is there. I have no idea what Mary's last name is. And yet she's old and I'd like to go see her. Mary A., we don't have anybody by that last name. Well, that would be the first initial. Don't you know who she is? Were you a friend or what? If you want to get hold of somebody on the phone and you don't have their phone number in your little phone book, how do you reach them? You don't have any idea what their last name is. And we've made a fetish out of that. It's too bad. It's almost got to the point now, if you use your last name, you're going to be sneered at and ridiculed, thought that you're trying to be a big shot or something. It's just a lot easier not to have to go through all that crap. But that has nothing to do with tradition. It's something that's just built up over the years. Going back on page 13, when writing or speaking publicly, notice the word publicly here, about alcoholism, we urge each of our fellowship to omit his personal name. Designate himself instead as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Now this particular sentence has significance beyond the obvious. The obvious being that in public we will not use our last name, but we will identify ourselves as a member of the fellowship. But this also is the only place in the Big Book, or anywhere in the literature that I know of, where how we introduce ourselves is specifically described. And what it means is, for the person who is here and has been criticized for example, for introducing themselves, my name is Jim, and I'm an addict and an alcoholic, and then somebody's about to come up at me and say, you're another one of those Andas, aren't you? I know guys who've been around a long time like me and who still can't get over it. They sit there at every meeting and count the Andas. And they'll talk about that. Oh, there are only 5 Andas here today. Well, that's foolishness, of course. But if you've got a sponsee who's having difficulty introducing themselves as an alcoholic, that's okay. All they have to do is introduce themselves as a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. My name is Jim, and I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous. And there's the authority for it right here in the Big Book. Now, it's an interesting phenomena in this fellowship that nobody can challenge that. It is unchallengeable. I'm a member when I say I am. Now, there are a lot of folks that would like to police all of this, you know, we've got there are all kinds of AA Nazis around who take it upon themselves to be the policemen of AA. And if they weren't causing harm, they'd be laughable. But can't laugh at somebody who goes around causing difficulties and disconcerting feelings and even rage and unhappiness especially among newcomers. It's not funny at all. But in any event, if anybody or any of you or any of your sponsors you have difficulty with, denounce yourself an alcoholic. The answer is right here. I'm a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's it. And that isn't very satisfactory with those who think that closed meetings are supposed to be some kind of exclusive club of some kind. And they freeze out everybody. I don't know what they're afraid of. I guess there might be a couple of little ladies in here writing their master's degree thesis who are auditing our meetings. We'll run right out and publish all of our names or something. Maybe that's the fear. Other than that, what is there to be afraid of? Why do we have closed meetings? What's the point of a closed meeting? The Big Book is quite clear about this. It tells us that the world of the Spirit is broad, roomy, all-inclusive, never exclusive or forbidding. It is open, we believe, to all men and women. Period. What the hell are we doing? You know what? One of the most dastardly parts of these closed meetings is that they exclude our families. And this is a family disease. What, some little 8-year-old kid's going to go rat us out? What's the... I can't figure it out. And yet what we're doing is we're foreclosing our families from many of the most important meetings. They get to come on birthday night, or if there's some big circuit speaker, big circus kind of atmosphere, we'll invite them. Other than that, keep your families away. Oh, and by the way, you got to control your kids. Lock them away somewhere. Sometimes your kids need it as badly as we do. We ever stop and think about that? My kids were AA brats by the time they were old enough to really start thinking about it. And stay with them the rest of their lives, too. It was the most wonderful thing that could have happened to them. It's a hell of a lot better to have me for a father. Okay, down to the bottom of page 13. We very earnestly ask the press also to observe this request, for otherwise we shall be greatly handicapped. Now that's been almost universally respected by the media. Almost never do you see a full name of anybody who identifies themselves as a member. And I'll tell you something, this has made a big impact on our press relations, our media relations, because it's pretty obvious if we don't want any publicity for ourselves that we don't have any axe to grind. We've got nothing to press forward with. We're not trying to get any notoriety or fame or fortune. And therefore, they tend to believe us. Our credibility has been tremendously aided by our anonymity. Now, so that's a part of we're seeing now the beginnings of the traditions, right here in the Accord of the First Edition, that we're going to designate ourselves as a member of AA, that we're not going to use our last name in public. We've asked the press to leave our names out of the press. And then we go on down to the bottom of the page. We're not an organization in the conventional sense of the word. Why? Because there are no dues or fees whatsoever. There's another tradition that was started right back here in the very beginning. The only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. There's another tradition. Remember, it was another 7 or 8 years before the traditions were actually written and adopted in 1950. So back here in 1939, we find much of this already had been learned, and it's right here in this forward of the first edition. Now, the only requirement for membership is an honest desire to stop drinking. There's still a lot of controversy about that, but they'd already learned that lesson. They learned that there wasn't any way that they could regulate who was to be a member and who wasn't. I mean, how do you go about doing that? How do you look inside somebody's mind and know that they're telling the truth about being an alcoholic? And what about the fact that so many today, especially today, so many people who have a problem with alcohol also have a problem with drugs, or with food, or with sex, or with codependency, or cocaine, on and on and on. There's all this stuff out there. And how are we going to segregate that out and say, well, you can't be a member of AA because you got all these other problems too? Well, they do better than that. In fact, in the Big Book, in the second chapter, it talks about the fact that they were using drugs too. Did you know that? Yeah. Anybody actually read that? It's right there. And so this has been going on forever. And so they found out that there was no way, and they couldn't set up a membership committee, for example. At first they tried to do this. The New York group used to require a prospective member to give them a financial statement. They didn't want any damn bums in their little group. They wanted people of substance. They wanted, and they were men too, not women, no women. They weren't letting women in. It was an exclusive men's club for that first 3 years. And after all, the women were too gentle and delicate and so on. And there's no way that they should be subjected to this kind of recovery. They should be sheltered in their homes, you see. Because these guys, they were basically chauvinists, but then I grew up in that period of time, and I know that was chauvinism. Wasn't called that at that time. It was just a normal way people looked at stuff. And so these traditions were already forming. And the idea that we had no way of monitoring whether somebody could be a member or not, they finally threw up their hands and said, well, all you have to have is a desire to stop drinking and you're a member. In other words, quite simply put, you're a member if you say you are, and nobody can question it. Well, they do all the time now, but they question everything else too. But it cannot stop anyone from being a member. And we are not allied with any faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. This whole business of being free of religion is really critical. They recognized this back then. Remember, too, that it's amazing that this came about. Because when this whole thing started, these guys, most of them were working with the Oxford group, and the Oxford group was flat-ass religion. Those guys thought that they were some kind of first-century Christians. And the Oxford movement went way back into English history. And so they were, in fact, practicing their form of religion. And our guys found out it didn't work for them. The people in Akron had to get over it quite a bit later. They hung on to the Oxford thing for quite a while after everybody in New York and Cleveland decided they didn't want that. But here, in 1939, just 3 years later, we find them having learned the lesson that we cannot be allied with any particular faith, sect, or religion. Now they had a clear message coming from back in the days in 1840s, 1830s, when the Washingtonians, that was a temperance group. They actually got a lot of people sober, but they allied themselves with the temperance movement. Their message was carried mainly in churches, and they had people come forth and find Christ and write take a pledge of abstinence. And so they were pushing the temperance movement. They were completely allied with the Christian churches, and then they took up the abolition of slavery as another issue. And our guys, looking back, they realized, see, the Washingtonians flourished and had about 100,000 members, and then they just as quickly went away. There were a few hangers-on for a few years after that, but basically the whole thing collapsed. And our guys looked at it and said, well, a big part of the reason they collapsed is because they were pushing religion. And they were they had a political agenda, the agenda of prohibition and the agenda of abolition of slavery. And so their singleness of purpose wasn't there. So you can see that a lot of the lessons that they had learned had already come to them through history. Looking back and seeing what had caused the demise of the Washingtonians, they could see that they didn't want to make those same mistakes. So they decided, and rightly so, that religion could play no part in the orthodoxy, that is, in the directions and so forth, in the Big Book. And that would have to be left to the conscience of the individual. He didn't always stick to that. Bill didn't stick to that when he wrote the 12 and 12, because he got all mixed up with the Catholic Church while he was doing that. And his sponsor at that time was Father Ed Dowling. And Father Ed was a Jesuit priest, and he was not a member of the fellowship, but he was very interested in AA. And he had a major input into the writing of the 12 and 12, that is the 12 steps part of it. And so therefore we got the Catholic prayer, the St. Francis prayer, and we got hit right between the eyes with sin, deadly sin, which has nothing at all to do with AA. And this was all a function of the mixing of religion with AA. And Bill had such a reputation, and he was such an icon at that time, that after he wrote this, even though there were a whole lot of people who said, hey, this isn't right, they went ahead and published it anyway. And now it's become a standard work, and everybody thinks it's, I don't know what they think. You can't compare 12 and 12 with the Big Book and come out, because they don't compare. The 12 and 12 simply negates and contradicts the Big Book in so many important areas. But I think a lot of it had to do with Bill having embraced, or trying to embrace, the Catholic religion. He was studying to be a Catholic, and working with the bishop in New York, and they finally told him he couldn't be, because he wasn't Orthodox enough. So he never got to be a Catholic, but he tried to be. So he made that mistake of throwing religious stuff into our literature, and that never ought to have been done. Because, as it says here, and he wrote these words, we are not allied with any particular faith, sect, or denomination, nor do we oppose anyone. We simply wish to be helpful to those who are afflicted. So that shows us that the foundation of the tradition was already pretty well established all the way back here in 39. And we shall be interested to hear from those who are getting results from this book, particularly from those who have commenced work with other alcoholics. We should like to be helpful in such cases. So we can see here, this is really the forerunner of the 11th chapter, which is going to detail how you go about getting a group started if you're out in Cucamonga, California. An inquiry from scientific, medical, and religious societies will be welcome. They made a major discovery when they were in their first 3 years that they had to be very careful not to piss off anybody out there in any of the established religions or in the scientific or medical disciplines, because this could be a major hamper to them getting new recruits. And they wanted the cooperation of these folks. And as a matter of fact, that cooperation has been pretty substantial. Today, probably not as much as it used to be, because there's a lot of professional jealousy out there now. It's very hard for people who have spent years and years in school to learn how to help us psychologically and physically and medically to finally admit that there's only so much they can do for us, and eventually most alcoholics are going to have to find a spiritual awakening, and the way you do that is through the work of the 12 steps. And so it's hard for them, I understand that, because it really means it's a negation of much of what they've learned. And this is true too, by the way, with most of the people in churches, that is the ministers and priests and rabbis and so forth, because their religion teaches them that there's nothing past God's power, and if they just get people to convert or to follow whatever the dictates of their religion should be, that'll be enough, that the old devil rum will be wrestled to the ground and defeated. And they're totally frustrated when that doesn't happen. And eventually some of them will come back and turn back to AA and say, okay guys, tell us what you're doing that we're not doing. And it turns out that there's a very simple reason for it. Our 12 steps and our big book contain exactly the same spiritual principles that most religions teach. But there's a huge difference, because the 12 steps are the way you incorporate those principles into your life. It's not enough just to know you ought to be some way, and agree with that, by the way, and say, that's right, that's right, that's right. And then have someone come along like your AA sponsor who can show you how to be that way. And the how-to is simply by working the steps. Practice these principles in all of our affairs, the 12 steps says. That means to work the steps in everything we do. Because these great spiritual principles are the same and across the board in all religions. And yet, in most cases, just knowing what the principle is doesn't mean that we have incorporated in our lives or that we live that principle. But when we live the 12 steps, we do. That's the genius of the 12 steps. That's the inspired genius of the 12 steps. And so we're getting now, there's more and more of a connection beginning to build up between the religious community and AA, because they're really beginning to find out that we have something to offer that they cannot emulate because they don't have it in their orthodoxy. I wrote 12 Steps for Christians just exactly for that reason, and it's working like a charm. And not just in some liberal church somewhere, but with the Baptist church, and that's where it's being used all over the country now. So we know that it works, and religious leaders are finding out that what we have is priceless. It's priceless. And it's an inspired method of applying spiritual principles in our lives by doing some simple work, by following some simple directions. It's strange, you know. It's been around forever, but never in this form, not until the Big Book was written. So we're very fortunate people. We're blessed. We have that. Now next week, we'll take a look at the forward to the second edition, and then we'll take a look at the doctor's opinion, and then we'll see where we go after that. But I recommend to you, if you haven't done it for a long time, that you might want to read it right up here in the beginning of the book, because what you'll find is that you're getting a beautiful introduction to whatever you're going to find in the rest of the Big Book. Between these forwards and the doctor's opinion and Bill's story, that's a pretty complete entree introduction to the whole program of Alcoholics Anonymous in those few chapters. And if you're sponsoring people, remember that. Don't let them start off somewhere in the middle of the book or start with Bill's story. If they start with Bill's story, they miss so much of what they need to know. Get them to start right back in the beginning of the book. And then read it all the way through. Steve reminded me, and let's just quickly remind ourselves, the first step is going to be composed of 4 things that you're going to have responsees do. 1, you're going to have them read the book. 2, you're having to go to meetings. 3, you're going to have them talking with and conversing with people in recovery, introduce them to some people with solid recovery. And maybe most important of all, we get them praying. And even if they don't want to pray, you tell them to pray anyway. Here's a little prayer you say. And if they don't believe in God, tell them, look, that's okay. Pray to whom it may concern, or God if you're there. But start praying. And when you do that, it's amazing what happens, because the miracles start happening to them real quick. Pretty soon they'll come and say, well, you know, this couldn't all be a coincidence. There's something going on here. Say, yeah, there sure is. Just keep doing it. You'll learn more and more about that. And by the way, if you have language of the heart, this business of getting somebody started praying, Bill addresses this in an article called, I believe it's called Take the 11th Step. And let's see if I can. My fingers aren't another one. Yeah, if you have language of the heart, there are 3 paragraphs on page 241, which lead you right along by the hand and show you what to do with somebody who's having difficulty with this idea of prayer. And the method it sets out for you there will work. Alrighty, I want to thank all of you so much for being here and allowing me to share this hour and a half with you. And I want to remind you that we have 2 more meetings today. Stairway Group meets 3 times on Saturday right here. The next meeting is at 7:30. That's the BigBook meeting, and we're reading the BigBook together. And at 9:15 we have a meeting centered on the language of the heart. I'd love to see you here at 7:30, and we have a good time. It's a nice group. They come from all over. There are not very many people who go to the group who actually go to most meetings here at 101 Club. But we got people coming from Dade County, and from South Beach, and from Palm Beach, and West Broward, from all over the place. It's a really nice group. I think you'll enjoy it. Okay, let's close the meeting. Yeah. Well, this is a really nice turnout, guys. I'm glad you're all here. Let's let this circle represent the unity of our fellowship. Let's have a moment of silence for those who are still suffering, and we'll say the Lord's Prayer together. I'd like to remind you that in our group we don't say anything after we say amen. Thank you. Lord's Prayer.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you all so much for being here. See you tonight or next week.
Jim, I'll see you either next week or sometime this week.
All right, Charlie boy.
Have a good night.
What happened to Tom? Yeah.
Good to see you. Good. See you tonight.
Oh, there he is.
I'll see you tonight, John.
All right, sweetie pie.
Bring my boyfriend.
steps for living. Do you have it published somewhere?
12 steps?
You said 12 steps for living or 12 concepts for living? When you started this portion of the meeting off?
I wrote the 12 steps of forever work.
Right.
We have copies of it here. But I can get you one right now if you want.
Great. That's what you were talking about, right?
Yeah, I wrote that and the 12 steps for sponsors and the 12 steps for Christians.
Right. The 12 steps for Christians, you said you were going to bring up to, just to remind me what you said. That's what I'm holding. That you were going to bring up to the other group tomorrow. To Boca.
I'm glad you reminded me.
Yeah, because a few people
I'll
had asked
dig
you to
some of
say.
those out and bring them with me. That's right, there are some people who want to. You,